10 o'clock on the morning of April 15th, 1865, 11 men gathered in a small room at the Kirkwood House in Washington, D.C. to watch as Chief Justice Solomon P. Chase administered the presidential oath of office to Andrew Johnson. The nation was both in shock and disbelief over the news that President Lincoln was dead. Furthermore, the work of, quote, binding up the nation's wounds, end quote, had yet to begin, and the new president was now responsible for nursing the country back to full health and union. After Lincoln's assassination, some Northerners called for stern retribution directed at the South. Others, however, believed that Lincoln's spirit of magnanimity must prevail. What would the new president do? Would he follow Lincoln's outline for Reconstruction, or would he set his own course? Hi, I'm Tom Army, and this is another edition of United States History Online. What was Abraham Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction? To be honest, historians are not entirely clear on this. We can cobble together some clues to his plan through memorandum, letters, and public addresses he made before his death. Lincoln believed the South had never legally seceded from the Union. Consequently, in Lincoln's December 1863 proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction, the president announced that if 10% of those who voted in the 1860 elections swore an oath of allegiance to the United States, then a state could proceed to call a state constitutional convention to write a new state constitution. To reestablish that state, the new Constitution needed to include an article declaring the abolition of slavery. Furthermore, specific individuals were not allowed to participate in the Reconstruction process. Those banned individuals had served as civil or diplomatic agents of the Confederacy, had held a military rank above colonel, or held a naval rank above lieutenant in the Southern Armed Forces. Lincoln's proclamation said nothing about giving freedmen, former slaves, the right to vote. Lincoln's personal and political positions on voting seemed complex. Between January and February 1864, General Nathaniel Banks, the military governor of Louisiana, organized elections for a new legislature and civilian governor using Lincoln's 10% criteria. After the elections, in March 1864, two African Americans from New Orleans called on Lincoln at the White House to discuss voting rights. Jean-Baptiste Rudens, a journalist and publisher, and Arnold Berthiaume, a wine merchant, met with Lincoln. Historian Michael Vornberg wrote that the visit probably did more than anything else to convince Lincoln that at least some Southern blacks should be granted the ballot. In anticipation of a new Louisiana State Constitutional Convention, Lincoln wrote to the newly elected governor, Michael Hahn, quote, "I barely suggest for your private consideration whether some of the colored people may not be let in to the elected franchise, as, for instance, the very intelligent, and especially those who have fought gallantly in our ranks," end quote. Eventually, Louisiana adopted their new constitution that July. But Congress in December refused to seat congressmen and senators from Louisiana because their new state constitution did not include black suffrage. Congress then went on to officially reject Lincoln's Reconstruction plan for Louisiana in early 1865. Lincoln was disappointed that Congress blocked the Louisiana Initiative. In a rare public address delivered on April 11, 1865, Lincoln once again discussed his Louisiana Reconstruction plan, offering an important comment on black suffrage. Quote, "It is also unsatisfactory to some that the elective franchise is not given to the colored man. I would myself prefer that it were now conferred on the very intelligent and on those who serve our cause as soldiers." End quote. This was the first time that an American president publicly announced his support for black suffrage, albeit limited. Many northern moderate and radical newspapers hailed the speech, calling it kindly and reassuring. But other papers accused Lincoln of, quote, "wantonly sacrificing white men for the shibboleth of racial equality," end quote. Lincoln was assassinated on April 14, 1865, 3 days after this public address. Andrew Johnson thus became responsible for carrying out what he considered to be the fallen president's wishes regarding Reconstruction. Johnson promised to be calculating and thoughtful, especially because Congress was in recess until the following December. Johnson began, according to most Republicans, on a solid note. On May 1st, he issued the order that 8 people arrested in the Lincoln assassination conspiracy be tried by a military commission and not a civil court. The following day, he put a bounty of $100,000 on the former Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who was captured on May 10th. By the end of May, Johnson began a period, however, that historians call self-reconstruction. On May 29th, he issued his own amnesty proclamation, similar to Lincoln's, including 14 categories of exemptions. Historian Eric Fauner argued that Johnson was determined to overturn the political and economic hegemony of the slaveocracy and assure the ascendancy of Unionist yeomen. In other words, Johnson appeared to favor elimination of social classes and the restoration of citizens' rights for all whites living in the South. Unlike Lincoln, Johnson started to grant amnesty to many former Confederate general officers and government officials. He passed acts that undermined the work of the Freedmen's Bureau, the agency created to foster the full transition of slaves into freedmen. Furthermore, Johnson allowed all the former Confederate states to form new governments and write new constitutions. Each state constitution had to abolish slavery, yet none of the new constitutions said a word about black suffrage, and Johnson was warned that if blacks were not enfranchised, former Confederates would elect former Confederates. In addition, states like North Carolina, South Carolina, and Mississippi wrote black codes designed to restrict the freedom of African Americans and assure the continuance of white supremacy. By November, reports began to arrive on Johnson's desk that Southerners were using violent coercion to keep blacks from voicing their concerns. Johnson ignored these reports. In December, when Congress reconvened, the former Confederate states, believing they had been fully restored, sent their representatives and senators to Congress. This body of legislators included the former Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens. But Congress refused to seat these representatives. Some more moderate Republicans, like Lyman Trumbull from the Senate and James G. Blaine from the House, wanted to leave Southern governments in place, but add federal protections for the rights of freedmen. Other Republicans, like Charles Sumner in the Senate and George Julian in the House, demanded black suffrage as a part of Reconstruction. Johnson was unwilling to compromise. The fight between the president and Congress was on, and it would eventually lead to Johnson's impeachment 2.5 years later. What went wrong? Did Johnson believe he was carrying out Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction? Was Johnson unable to overcome his own personal prejudices? Unable to change? Unable to compromise? Historian Elizabeth Varnon wrote that Johnson was a virulent racist and a president who believed that the greatest achievement of the war was emancipating the white man, disenthralling the common man from the dominance of the planter class. According to Johnson, the old planter class would have to share power with white yeomen, white freemen having the right to vote. Northern anti-war Copperhead Democrats who deplored Lincoln's policies and former Confederates both embraced Johnson's plan for immediate restoration of Confederate states. Johnson would not consider black suffrage and would not consider a civil rights bill that would invalidate the black codes written by 3 Confederate states to limit the freedoms of former slaves. President Johnson's decisions would set Reconstruction on a very different course than any could have imagined. What did go wrong?